Hello, everyone. Today is October 5th, 2022. My guest today is Jacob Kishere. Jacob is the host of SenseSpace Podcast. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Jacob.
Thank you, Kurish. It's good to be back for my third appearance.
Third,
Third
third
appearance,
appearance.
maybe fourth.
Technically fourth, but the first one was never up. You know what? I actually think this is either 4 or 5, but
Right.
I think this could be 5 actually, but the first one ever was not, because that was episode 2. Episode 1 was me by myself, but you were episode 2.
Well, I'm glad to be back, and hopefully we'll figure out SenseSpace at some point. I guess I'm going to be here today in my capacity as somebody who's been exploring conscious cannabis culture and is launching a new project, yet undefined, called Insight Cannabis. Really exploring and creating ideas and developing vision for cannabis culture going forward into the future. And I know you've been wanting to have a conversation around these issues, so I'm really excited to see where we go today.
Yes, it's an interesting topic and an interesting time for that topic, especially in the United States and I would say in most of the Western world. So, what does conscious cannabis culture mean to you?
Thanks for asking. Yeah. For me, the way I've understood it is that cannabis culture today is in a state of immaturity. It's been largely marginalized. It's been pushed off into the underground, into the black market by the government, by the authorities. And we have a lot of evidence now that was based on racist policies, that was actually exercised in order to sort of prosecute and undermine minority communities in the United States. That policy was then spread all around the world through the UN by the Nixon administration. And I want to sort of leave more of the legal stuff over to you in this conversation, but what I've really been putting forward is the notion that today we have a cannabis culture which is immature. It's kind of mixed up with different variations. It's kind of like a fun, silly stoner culture. I call it like Seth Rogen, Harold and Kumar, kind of get high on the couch, do video games. There's like a hip hop, urban West Coast culture. There's also European variations of this street culture. And then there's kind of like a Bob Marley white guy with dreadlocks, raw papers, hippie culture. And so what I'm really advancing is something that's not any of those things. I want to give appreciation, respect to those things. I want to engage a conversation with people who are passionate about cannabis, but conscious cannabis culture is about cannabis use that is intentional. It's about cannabis being brought in a way that is responsible, that increases our responsivity to the world, to our lives. Ultimately utilizing cannabis in a way that is in service of life, in service of our well-being. And I can get more into that, but for me, it's about contextualizing cannabis, not just in the cannabis conversation, which can be kind of fragmented and viewed in isolation, but really seeing it as part of the whole, thinking about how it relates to issues of collective trauma healing, and the health of society, which is really important to our functioning capacity to make sense, to uphold the values and freedoms that we have. And it's also about developing a creativity and capacity to address the problems of the day. And I think as we look around, there is a feeling that the civilizational game is kind of coming to a crisis point, and we kind of know what the problems are, but there's a sort of paralysis in how to address them, how to organize, how to make sense together, and so on. And so this is sort of part of the sobering, I guess, aspect of what I want to bring into cannabis conversation. But hopefully it's something that actually uplifts, enables, increases the sovereignty, the capacity of people who are passionate about cannabis, who use cannabis part of their lives, and also reaching out to people who, could benefit from conscious cannabis use as well.
So, how would you respond to someone who sees cannabis not in those light? So, for example, you said healing. It could be used to understand context, societal contexts. What about cannabis can do that? What isn't about this drug that isn't just get high? Few people may see it as just that, a gateway drug. It's just something you get high. You stated it can induce creativity. What about cannabis can heal or induce creativity within a person?
Sure. I mean, for me, cannabis can be a gateway to many things. Traditionally, it's been sort of maligned as just a gateway to other drugs, a gateway to heroin addiction or something like that.
More dangerous drugs.
Other dangerous drugs. And there is a logic to that, in that the way that the government has categorized drugs is completely immature, completely unscientific, irrational, grouping this wide variety of substances together under this word drug. This is really a limitation on our intelligence as a human collective, to put something like ibuprofen, MDMA, opiates, cannabis, caffeine, like just putting all of these things under one term, and then arbitrarily drawing a line and saying these ones are legitimate, these ones are illegitimate. And the basis of that, as we know, is quite hazy. So
it's very hazy.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit, just outdated, I would say. A lot of these laws that we speak about, they are based off of the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. And then you mentioned earlier that sort of thinking that act enacted was globalized, which is very interesting because, before 1967, marijuana was legal in the United States. It was taxed, but it wasn't a federal crime. And then after that, as you said, placing all of these substances into one category. And these are a lot of substances. I mean, methamphetamine. There are forms of methamphetamine which are pharmaceuticalized, dosed, regulated, and placed, into patients' hands. Opium is a Schedule II drug substance. Cocaine, fentanyl, Schedule II. And, marijuana is a Schedule I, which means it is above all of those other drugs I just listed, such as cocaine, fentanyl, opium. And, methamphetamines, it's not to say what is or isn't, but one thing we can say is it's very difficult to place all of these substances, which have very different interactions with our body. There's no doubt many of these substances, most of these, I don't think we don't want these in our body. They're terrible, most of them. But the issue is that what if one isn't? What if there's one substance on this list that is actually not a harmful drug, but it's listed as the most harmful drug?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. And majority of American people, I don't know the statistics, but I would assume that most people at this point recognize that that is a ridiculous way of scheduling. Even if we were just to take a very general sense of what's most dangerous, what's likely to lead to deaths, possibly hundreds of thousands of deaths, what's likely to lead to addictions that then spiral into social problems, epidemics of homelessness like you're seeing in Austin, San Francisco, and across the United States. When we talk
And
about that,
not even just that, it creates criminal supply chains on top of that. When something is criminalized, but there's still a market for it, more often than not, a criminal supply chain will supply that market, whether that be arms in a foreign country or drugs in the United States. And
yeah,
since the 1970 Controlled Substance Act, we have seen a very intense form of criminal supply chains with regards to drugs within the country of the United States, and I believe within Europe too.
yeah, yeah. And I would say, in a certain sense, the black market, the drugs black market, has been created by the authorities. And then they have, particularly through organizations like the DEA, basically engaged in an arms race with the black market that they've then created. So the DEA gets more money to go and fight this war on drugs against the black market. And this has caused untold destruction, despair, and chaos, not just within the United States, but across the entire world. These supply chains are, of course, global, especially if you look at something like cocaine. And there's certainly more to be said, even in the context of legal cannabis, how the way the markets are being structured now is still kind of incentivizing a black market and not really giving rise to a healthy legal market. But setting that aside and just coming back to like engaging with this kind of boomer mentality, this very simplistic approach to drugs that we're still grappling with. And we live in I think it's described as a gentocracy, a society where senior people and the attitudes that are propagated amongst them are in control of most of the institutions of power. What I've come to realize is that when we talk about drugs, we're not talking about an objective reality. The drugs are constituted of the compound, the chemical, and the context or the culture. And an example that I like to bring up and that I wrote about in my piece on Conscious Cannabis Culture that people can check out on Substack is tobacco. And tobacco is a plant, discovered in the New World in the 1600s, but it's a plant that has a context in indigenous culture that is medicinal. If you go to an ayahuasca ceremony, a medicine ceremony, if you go into these indigenous contexts, they're using tobacco ceremonially in a very particular way, in a way that is used to sort of cleanse the body. It involves purging. And for them, tobacco really has a spirit, and it's viewed as something that can bring healing, something that can bring clarity. And then you take that plant and you bring it through into a particular context of market capitalism, through the 1940s and 50s, probably long before that. And you get the cigarette industry. and it's exploitative, and it's addictive, and there's no sense of sacredness, there's no sense of intentionality, and it's propagated very widely, and it leads to these huge health implications. So we have in that instance one plant with two very different cultural contexts. What I'm saying is that's true of all compounds, all plants, even things that, you know, people think this is a good drug, this is a legal drug, this is something pharmaceutical. That drug in one dose is poison and deadly, and in another dose is medicine. So we have to be very nuanced when we're talking about this, even with things like amphetamines, even with many of the drugs we talked about. I think there are probably contexts, doses, and particular ways in which those might be useful. We might use them with wisdom in certain cases in a medical context. But again, with this kind of immature approach, we said these are the bad ones, these are the good ones, and we need to get a lot more nuanced. And so with that, maybe we can explore a little bit like cannabis in particular. Like, what is it about cannabis that distinguishes it? Why is it special? Why is it valuable? And what am I like advocating for when I'm saying conscious cannabis culture can be a force for good, can be in service to people's well-being, in service to people leading a more meaningful life, and actually in service of addressing the problems in society today.
What allows someone, how does cannabis assist society in addressing problems of today?
Sure. So one of the biggest challenges in society today, for me, is the problem of collective trauma healing. We live in a culture which has inherited a buttload of trauma from several generations of war, Second World War, First World War, generations of institutional abuses, generations of educational abuses, religious abuses, and so on. And the consequence of that actually is a huge rate limiter on our capacity as human beings to sense our environment, to make sense of our environment, to connect and communicate well with one another, and also consequently leads to a whole range of health problems, chronic disease, immunological issues, cancers. Many of these things are rooted in psycho-emotional trauma that's not understood or recognized. So when we can go on a process of healing, what we're doing is integrating those parts of ourselves that we're cut off from, and in doing so, potentially increasing our capacity to sense what we're seeing in the world, even being able to hold more. Like, if a lot of people in society have nervous systems that are filled with anxiety, which they have good reason to be, given the experience of COVID lockdowns and the experience of addictive social media, and other social problems, that actually kind of can bring us into a much more limited scope of concern. And we become fearful and unable to really open ourselves up to sense the whole picture and begin to sort of move in relationship to the whole and consider how we might connect, communicate, and create in response to that. So I guess what I'm speaking to is very general, core human capacities that are being limited in various ways that I believe cannabis can help with. In my personal journey, I experienced various forms of post-traumatic stress, and cannabis for me was the only tool that I found helped me to heal that. I went through really challenging periods in my early 20s owing to relationship issues, and consequently being in nature, using cannabis medicinally allowed me to connect with something beyond myself. It allowed me to break through disassociation, get connected to something larger, get connected to nature, and ultimately heal. And I believe there's a lot of evidence that this same process is happening for veterans. There are many veteran groups in the United States who are utilizing cannabis in California and Colorado that are therapeutic contexts in which cannabis is being cultivated to have particular qualities that are then combined with talk therapy, somatic therapy, so that people can go deep into the body and release things. And so there's a lot of possibilities for healing with cannabis. And when we look around today, especially in the United States, I think what we see is that there's a huge amount of mental health challenges, what we call mental health. And the solutions that are being offered in the pharmaceutical and commercial context are in many ways more addictive, potentially more harmful, in a general sense, less natural. Cannabis is something that could be grown at a community level. It's not difficult to manufacture. It doesn't require a pharmaceutical patent. And it's something that people can develop their own relationship with, and perhaps even a love or affection for in a responsible way.
It, you know, California, you can't drive down a highway within one of the three major cities, probably four if you count Sacramento, without seeing a billboard for recreational cannabis. So that market capitalization of a commodity has occurred to a certain degree to marijuana, to cannabis. And as it comes into this society, that culture, it can be exploited, and it is being exploited. I mean, I remember a few years ago, everyone was talking about cannabis stock. Canada, I believe, legalized cannabis. So the Canadian Stock Exchange actually trades cannabis companies, and that was a big commodity. People were talking about, hey, should we buy some cannabis stock and get in on this? And as you said, there's a very large, there was very little nuance in this classification of drugs. These are good, these are bad. Prescription opiates, caffeine, alcohol, cigarettes, cigars, those are okay. Everything else, that's bad. Antidepressants is good. And there's very little nuance. And the most interesting thing about that is that in the last 52 years since the passing of the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, the progress in biology, chemistry, how substances interact with the body on a molecular level, maybe not molecular level, but on a very nanoscale level, rather than in 1970 someone smoked something and then you see how it affects them. Now we have much more data. We understand a lot more. There's a lot more studies out most people understand that if it's not a randomized control study, it maybe shouldn't even be referenced. And so we need to update that classification of all of these drugs. And as you said, this is complex. This is chemistry. This isn't just, ooh, that one seems bad. I mean, most of the ones that are on the 1970 Controlled Substance Act, those are awful drugs, almost all of them. But that doesn't mean that outright criminalizing them is a good strategy for lowering addiction of those drugs. And also, it is, as you said, there's no nuance, and we're not accepting the progression in science, the progression in chemistry, the progression in biology, in neurobiology. There are each one of these drugs, you go through the listing of the Schedule 1, Schedule 2 drugs. These are very different drugs.
Yeah.
Granted, there are a lot of psychedelics on Schedule 1. Schedule 2 has a lot of, uppers, some sort of amphetamines and opiates. So, but at the end of the day, this isn't, you can't really, it's hard to compare marijuana and cocaine. It's just, yeah, they both change the mental state of the individual who's consuming them. But are we going to say that we can really, these are the same? These two are just drugs. And, if one person gets high on one, it's like they have 20% more highness than the person who gets high on the other. And,
No.
we need,
It's
no.
absurd.
What?
It's absurd.
It's
I think
absurd.
it's clearly absurd, and I even want to challenge the sort of badness, because I don't think that if I have a chemistry lab and I have a vial with some, synthetic cocaine, or I have some fentanyl in a vial, that's just a compound. That's not morally bad, except in relationship to society, in relationship to culture, in relationship to people. If there's nobody who's fiending after that, if there's nobody who's exploiting that to exploit people's addictions, then it's not objectively bad. And what we ought to do really is look at what are the root causes of addiction. Why do people go to these substances? And I think it's also worth mentioning that there's ways in which these somewhat arbitrary drug scheduling regime has been set up in ways that fit with the cultural paradigm, the cultural context of capitalism as we've known it. Industrial society, post-industrial modern society, alcohol, a depressant, a disassociative, something that helps people to cope with lives that are not necessarily getting them connected to what's most meaningful. You can see in the history of industrial Britain that people lived on the land, they lived in kind of pastoral contexts in villages. Then that was completely disrupted by the Industrial Revolution. People were kind of stripped off the land, sent to the cities to work in factories. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge explosion of alcoholism. You have all of these women drinking gin and just everybody drinking all the time. That's not a coincidence. That's a consequence of the cultural context. Equally so, cocaine, I think, is a drug that is typically done by people on a kind of acceleration, grind, ego upholding, affirming mentality. It was the drug of the 80s. It's the drug of bankers and the city. It's a drug that is it's well known to most people what the consequences of that drug trade are. So choosing to do it is usually choosing to ignore the consequences. It's choosing sort of lower your consciousness to just be like, I'm going to do this cocaine here without concern for the people that are being exploited and killed by that trade. Cannabis.
Even if we can go back to that and just note that even in our society, Narcos, the Netflix television show, was so popular. We all saw, a biopic of the most, one of the most deadly men in the history of Colombia and his rise to extreme wealth through a very violent supply chain that eventually ended in the United States of America. And then we as Americans gobbled that television show up. Well, at the same time, it's hard to ignore the fact that, how did, what money were those narcos bringing in? Those were American dollars. And this is after the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. This is after the criminalization of cocaine. And yet these supply chains went on very successfully for years. And, it's tough for us to even admit that what's the system going on here that induces this? And when we're just watching a biopic of these historical events and they're very entertaining, we're doing exactly what you said. We're ignoring where we hold a little bit of accountability here. And it's a little embarrassing, I would say, to just be like, oh, this horrible reality is partly because of a law. Americans are powerful people. Americans are powerful people. We work a lot and we do a lot of things. And sometimes the way we act has a butterfly effect past what we can actually see. And this is one of those examples where there was a lot of cocaine being brought into the country. People were just having fun, consuming it. And you know what? There's nothing, cocaine is a pretty bad drug with pretty terrible consequences. But even with the criminalization of that, even with the knowledge that this is a very strong narcotic, it didn't matter. People still consumed it. And so we have to take that into account that, okay, addicts are going to be addicts. They're going to consume the drugs that they want. There is a drug addict's desire to get high is a very strong desire. A drug addict has no stronger desire than that. And so to think that criminalizing is going to stop that and somehow induce a more rich society, we've come to realize that it's obvious when you look into any major street on the West Coast, any major city on the West Coast, that this form of drug policy obviously doesn't work because people are on tents on the streets getting high on God knows what.
Yeah.
So and then you were going to go, I'm sorry to break that off, but that's just something, you brought that up and I wanted to highlight that it's not just about letting people do as they want. It's about creating systems that are able to not be nonsensical. Because the current state of criminal supply chains of narcotics in the Americas, that is nonsensical. if we want to talk about something that is just absurd.
Mm.
And it's been like this since the introduction of the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. And so it's just something for people to be aware of, that criminalizing these substances, we're talking mostly about cannabis, conscious cannabis culture, because we actually believe that cannabis is not a dangerous drug, and it just holds a very deep relation to this act because it was looped in with all of these other drugs, which is understandable. But as we've discussed, there's very high nuance between substances, and the classification of cannabis, we believe, as a Schedule 1 drug, and then that globalization of that sort of thinking was harmful.
Yes. Yeah. And just to underline that point, if people don't realize this yet, there are quotes from the chief of staff in the Nixon administration several decades after he was in office, where he admits straight up the inclusion of marijuana and the targeting of that war on drugs was basically envisioned to target the blacks and the hippies, the anti-war left, the opponents of the war in Vietnam. That was the real driving reason that this was brought in. It wasn't a public health driven policy. And as you say, it's not working. It's not working at the level of the middle class, the prosperous, the college students. I've certainly seen my share of it in California and in London. It's all over the place. And it's not working for the poor. It's not working for the addicts. In my opinion, it would be better that those people are, at the very least, getting that stuff not on the black market. But that's a linear solution. And a lot of what we're seeing in cities like Austin and California and so on, not California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, is these linear approaches to the problem. That like, okay, we're going to bring in clean needle supply, give somewhere where people can go and consume that heroin in a not on the street context with clean needles and some medical stop. But they're not going beyond that. They're just having people come in, they're doing the heroin, they're going right back out onto the street. We need to really broaden our perspective. We need to be able to look at the whole. We need to see what are the roots of these people who end up on the street. And if we trace it back, those people are very often, people who grew up in abusive households, people who grew up child abuse, grew up with parents who were themselves addicts, grew up in context of poverty, social nets that have been undermined and decaying for decades. So it's really an interconnected web of issues. And one of the properties I think that cannabis and psychedelics both offer us is opening our senses, deepening our senses, enabling us to perceive more, to perceive interrelationship and connection. And they do shift our consciousness. And this is part of the reason that the sort of old regime has been so against cannabis and psychedelics, because they were a challenge, because they would change culture, because culture and compound, they're in a dance. Cocaine has consequences on culture, and that creates the music, and then the music feeds back on what people think is cool, and then they go and do those drugs. You can see this in the recent history of rap music, where you do have this kind of degeneration of rap, where it becomes more and more about popping Xannies and more about lean, and it just becomes really about this kind of spiral into inebriation and addiction. But what's underneath that is the collective trauma, the crisis of meaning, the crises of connection that are not just in the Black community, but in the whole of American society, in the heart of American society. And so thankfully, there are people doing the work of overturning these bullshit laws. There's great work being done by an organization called MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Research, Science. I can't remember what the S stands for, but Rick Doblin's organization has been working for decades now to get the research to prove that psilocybin from magic mushrooms is one of the most powerful tools for healing available in the world today. LSD, also derived from a fungus, is one of the most powerful healing tools that we have available to us for healing trauma, for addressing people's existential anxieties when they are having a terminal cancer diagnosis, for people who have depression that none of our shitty options are addressing. And so the research is coming through. And thank God that those people were devoted enough to go out and get law degrees and figure out how to navigate this really difficult bureaucratic structure, such that we are now seeing MDMA and psilocybin medicinal legalization on its way very soon. Phase 3 clinical trials with MDMA, I think, are underway already. And so too with cannabis. The research is that the green wave, as I called it in my piece, is already happening. It's happening in Germany. It's happening across the United States. It's already happened in Canada. This thing is set in motion.
Happened in Thailand.
But I'm not, this may surprise people, but I'm not against making money. I'm really happy that there's money, that there's prosperity, that tax revenues are being generated by cannabis. I think that's great. There's also lots of solid science that says this is one of the least dangerous, least addictive plants. I want to throw away the word drug. Cannabis is a plant with different properties, a range of properties. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of different ways we can use it. And so conscious cannabis culture is about what's the next step in that conversation. What do we want to envision? What are the broader possibilities? How can this be a tool for creativity, for problem solving, for therapy, for deepening our connection with nature, which has become existentially important to the continuation of our civilization?
One culture that I think is very cannabis conscious are the Dutch, Netherlands, and their relationship with cannabis seems, you go there, you realize cannabis is legal, and then you assume everyone here must smoke pot every day. No, their rates of cannabis ingestion are lower than the United States. So what is it then? It's just a substance. It's a substance that they recognize isn't detrimental to their society. It's a substance they recognize can have a recreational position in their society. For some people it's medicinal, but even then I don't think that they really output it in a medicinal format. But at the end of the day, what we can recognize is their society has not gotten anywhere near faltering. They have a very rich society, a very, when it comes to mathematics, they have some of the brightest minds in the world. And to say that that's related to cannabis would be ridiculous. But to say that that sort of culture that is able to nurture the sort of minds that can be some of the strongest in mathematics in the world is the same sort of culture that can realize that this substance is not harmful, not detrimental, depending on the context it's used. If someone's smoking every day, all day, yes, there are contexts to cannabis that can be harmful, and we can recognize that. just, you mentioned this at the beginning. There's a difference in dose. Caffeine, there's a huge difference in dose. You take 1, 2 cups of coffee a day, 3 maybe. 3 is a lot, depending on the size. 1 or 2, that's pretty good. You start having 10 cups of coffee a day, something around that something around those, that's going to be a much different relationship with caffeine, much different chemistry balance and how you're able to react when you get off of that caffeine. Same with alcohol. We all recognize people will say, oh, 1 to 2 glasses of wine a night isn't so bad, maybe every few nights. Yes, that's not bad. Someone who slams a 30 pack down every day, that is, and that, to say that's not, some people do that. Some people buy a 30 pack of beer and then just drink it. And then that's their night. So there's a difference in this dose. And I think at the end of the day, we can recognize even those two drugs, like alcohol. Alcohol is one of the deadliest drugs in the world, possibly the deadliest, the one that results in, the most deaths as a result of this drug, whether that be through car accidents, whether that be through someone just being very inebriated for any reason and making a poor decision. And we still let people consume this because we recognize this isn't going to destroy the majority of society. In some cases, it does. I think I've heard of the gin epidemic of the 19th century in England, where parents were actually rolling over and killing their children in bed because they were so drunk on gin. I believe that, and then I think that's where the crib was invented. That's the invention of the crib, was because people were getting so drunk in England that they were killing their children while rolling over them, that they actually had to create this new piece just for the child so that they wouldn't roll over them in their sleep. So at times there are. And then we also have the opium epidemics, opium wars of China. So that also, where drugs were played a huge toll on society. Even today, I would say the role, I listened to a podcast maybe a year ago, maybe a few years, 2 years ago at this point, that spoke about there is a new sort of meth. And so the meth of the last 10 to 12 years, 10, 14 years, is not the same meth that was being smoked beforehand. And this new meth is actually a reason for the tense. It's because, the way that I'm not sure who explained it, but the way that the body interacts, it's the same drug. They're both meth, but the way that it's created, the way that the compounds actually are formed at the end, change the reaction to it when it's smoked or inhaled, or I don't know how people are using meth nowadays, but the reaction is different. And there actually is some sort of neuroticism with people who smoke this meth. And that's the reason that these tents have gone up everywhere, because people can't be around other people while high on this meth. And so I guess, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but at the end of the day, I think the one thing, I think what I wanted to say was that there's always a possibility of a drug having a really detrimental toll on the people. But I think we can also see that marijuana is, possibly not that. And also, if we go back to it, speaking about meth and even opium, those are highly synthesized drugs. And although today there are forms of cannabis that are highly synthesized, like vaping and concentrates, and, those can be those might not even be in the same category just because they're so concentrated with the cannabis. But what we're talking about is the plant, marijuana, hemp. I mean, hemp is legal, but even just, regular plant marijuana, that isn't going to be detrimental to society. And we, there are already within, as you said, Canada has had the green movement. Germany is having the green movement. 19 states within the United States, that's almost 40% of the United States, have legalized recreational cannabis, while 37 have legalized medicinal. This is a direct contradiction to the federal law, the 1970 Controlled Substance Act. And I don't think people, Americans, we always talking about, all right, we'll do it later. Cannabis isn't that big of a deal. There are bigger issues on the plate.
No.
People, there aren't. You talk to, for example, Brittany Griner.
Let's do it now.
Yes. I mean,
this is also forcing honest people to lie.
Yes.
It's propagating falsehood. It's forcing people into a regime of fear and bullshit, to protect their jobs out of fear of trespassing against these laws that are not founded in reason at all. And if America is going to be rooted in anything, it's got to be rooted in people telling the truth, people expressing what they know deep down to be true, and creating laws together that are in concordance with that. And so, even if it was the most debauched, commercialized, unconscious integration of cannabis into society, we would not see an epidemic of deaths, because nobody dies from smoking cannabis. People do die from smoking cigarettes. People do die from drinking alcohol. People do die from using opiates, all of which are legal. So, in the absence of any kind of conscious cannabis culture, cannabis should still be legal today, on the grounds of just being consistent with what already is. But we have something better than that. We have this rich possibility of a conscious cannabis culture that actually is encouraging people to sense more deeply into their choice making, to make more responsible decisions with their lives, to heal, to get connected with nature, to get connected with what's meaningful, to ultimately sort of address the root causes of addiction. So, yeah, I don't really have too much more to say on it. I think cannabis should be legalized, must be legalized. And beyond that, let's start this conversation about the possibility of that and what a mature American society looks like. There's a maturation, there's a leveling up, and I think we have to kind of believe aspirationally in Americans, in humanity, that we can do this, rather than sort of holding us all to the lowest common denominator and expecting the lowest out of everybody.
My guest today has been Jacob Kishere. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Jacob.
Thanks so much, Guru. It's been wonderful.